I want to reflect a little bit on the experience of refugees as a group. I want to talk about something called personhood and how it relates to culture, and we heard about cultural humility, which is a really important concept. And then I'm going to go over the 8 most important things, at least that international researchers have come up with, to help people feel more settled. So these are kind of general things that we can all try to do. Talk to you a little bit about psychosocial capacity building, but I really want to talk about resilience. What is it, and how can all of you work with resilience so that you're empowering people and not in any way taking away from or undermining? And then lastly, how as a community we can support refugees. So that's what I hope to cover. Sound okay? All right. So I'm going to do a little exercise now. We just heard from a panel where people were talking about their experiences. I want to ask you to imagine what it might be like for you. So let's imagine that armed conflict has broken out in the United States. And society is breaking down. The institutions that we normally rely on are we can no longer take them for granted. So in order to be safe, you and your family, whoever that might be, you flee to Canada. And you're kept in a displaced persons camp for 2 years in Canada. But Canada is unwilling to accept US refugees on a permanent basis. But Asia and countries in Asia are willing to take in people who have been displaced by the conflict in the United States. So you're finally allowed to migrate to an Asian country, China, Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, and there are communities that are poised to welcome you as you're going to Asia. And I'm assuming most people here don't speak languages in these countries. However, many of your extended family and your friends are not able to go with you. Okay, so I really want you to try and imagine what this might be like. So here's the questions, and I'd like you to talk about it with people at your table, and we'll take about 10 minutes to do this. What do you imagine that you would miss the most? What would present the greatest challenges to you as you move to your new home in Asia? And the third one, which we heard a bit about this morning, what would you want educators, law enforcement, social service workers, medical providers, therapists, the equivalent of circles of care, etc., to keep in mind as they work to support you? So those are the 3 questions, okay? Do you have any questions about the questions or what the exercise is? Okay, let's try this for 10 minutes. So I'm just going to ask you to do a little bit of a shout out about what are some of the things that came up. We'll take it question by question. I will repeat what you say so that everybody in the group can hear you. So what do you imagine that you would miss the most? What did you talk about? Just yell it out. Family. Okay, especially knowing that family hadn't come with you. Friends. So just to flag this, as simple as it sounds, relationships. People who you have relationships with. What else? Security. Security and competency, they kind of go together, don't they? That you kind of know what you're doing. And that makes you feel more secure. Things are more predictable, more understandable. Yeah.
Maybe given that moving to Asia, I'm a woman, maybe the right to come and go as I choose, make my own decisions about my life.
So can I reframe it and say you don't know whether you'd be able to come and go as you currently are able to do, and relating that to your being a woman. Is that close enough? Okay, thanks. Yeah. The comforts of home, you know, the things that we take for granted that we feel really secure about and comfortable with. What else?
Our children.
Anything else you want to say about your children?
Not just the family system, but I think the most horrific thing would be to miss our children if we ever had to be separated from our children.
So to be separated from one's children is for you, the most horrible thing to imagine, or the hardest thing to imagine? Thank you. Yeah. So having a place in society where you're recognized and seen as having worth and value. And we heard this morning about how hard that can be to not have that. Yeah. Right, so that's a really important point. We're not all just in the moment. We're looking ahead to what we think will be the future. And it's harder to do that in this scenario, much harder. And that affects how we feel in the present. And just being able to speak your own language, right. And that's one of those things we can take for granted as a sense of security, those at least who feel comfortable speaking English in this country, or English and Spanish to some extent. Yeah, like knowing how to get to places, feeling comfortable with the climate, with the topography. Right, again, those are things, even when people move within this country, sometimes people complain about that. But let's move to the second one. What do you think would present the greatest challenges to you as you move to Asia and your new home? Language. Everybody's talking about language, and we certainly heard that loud and clear this morning. Identity through work. Say more about that.
Just having a job here that is, helps me feel useful and having a role in society.
Having a social role, feeling like you're contributing, knowing who you are. Having status, knowing what your status is, knowing what other people's status is.
How to make peace with being where I am when what I really long for is to go back.
So how to, in a sense, resettle, but acknowledging that you really don't want to be there and you're longing for someplace else, home. Thank you. Yes? So that's a really complicated point, which is having in your mind and spirit a sense of what it was, but not knowing what it currently is. And we, again, really heard that this morning. Ann?
Being so reliant on, not knowing anything, being so reliant on others and not being able to be self-sufficient and take care of things.
So not being self-sufficient, being dependent and reliant on other people, and not being used to that. Alan?
Knowing the rules, both the legal rules and the unwritten kind of cultural norms.
Knowing the formal rules, like the laws, we heard the example about not knowing how the traffic was working, but also the informal rules, like how close do you get to somebody? Do you make eye contact? Do you say good morning as you pass people? How do men and women interact? There's just a lot of rules that we're always kind of aware of on an unconscious level, but they're guiding how we behave. Yes?
We live in a very diverse and multicultural society, so moving to a more homogeneous society would be an adjustment.
So this society is relatively multicultural and heterogeneous, and that's a really important point to keep in mind as we're talking about what this society is, but moving to a much more homogeneous society, and what a shift that would be. Anything else anybody wants to add to that? Last one. Yeah.
Worry about the people that we left behind, concern about how other people are doing and maybe not being able to gather information about them.
So not knowing what happened to people, feeling worried and concerned about people, not necessarily being able to have information about people.
Maybe a little guilty.
Feeling guilty.
Okay, I'm doing all right, but don't know.
Yeah, almost like a survivor guilt type of thing. Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that in. I'm not going to have to do any lecturing. You've covered just about every point I was going to make. Let's quickly look at the third point. What would you want educators, all the different people who are in the room today, and our equivalents in the Asian host country we were moving to, what would you want them to keep in mind as they work to support you? Don't judge. Don't judge and don't stereotype. Okay, that's really, I don't know, it's a hard one to take in because it's like we're constantly making generalizations about people or countries or cultures that we don't seem to know a lot about, and yet none of us like being generalized about or being stereotyped. So we would hope that people would see us in our fullness and our complexity.
Yeah, and everybody has a story. You're just seeing it, like they have a large puzzle. You're only seeing one piece of it, so you can't actually say that you know something unless you heard the story. And
So that you would want people to recognize that they were only seeing a little piece and that there was a lot more to you than that little piece that they were seeing, and to give you space to be a full person. Thank you. What else? Yes?
That I don't know what I don't know. So, you know, it says, what do you want them to know? I want them to know that I have no idea what their culture is and what the rules are.
Okay, so to be aware of how little you feel you know. So both to take you as a complex person and be respectful of that, but to also recognize how little you know. That's holding some contradictory types of things. Yeah, Susan, and then.
I would want people to be patient and not assume anything about me. To be patient and not assume anything about me.
So to be patient and not make assumptions, not stereotype, not make assumptions, but patience about all the things that have to be learned and what we don't know.
I think it's related to what she said, that basically I don't want them to assume that I'm being difficult. I just don't know, or I'm trying the best I can, I don't understand, and just be patient and continue to support me.
Being patient, but what I'm also hearing is assuming good intentions, assuming that you're a good person and that you're trying your hardest, and that you're not being bloody-minded or difficult or deviant. Okay, yeah.
I was thinking, why are you coming to me? What do you want me to do? Are you trying to make me into a citizen of your country? Are you trying to make me into something I'm not? I mean, why is the law enforcement coming, the social service worker coming, the educator? Where are they trying to take me to?
So really trying to understand the purpose of things, to what end, why these people are involved with you, and what they expect of you. And then also what I'm hearing you say is, it's not even clear, are you being expected to become Chinese?
I'm fine. So what do you want, what's unfine about me that you want to fix?
Okay, so what do you want to fix so that you're assuming that having all those people here is not a good thing about you? It's not saying...
It suggests that I have a lot of deficits.
And that doesn't feel good. Yes, thank you.
One thing that I was thinking about is a desire for human connection in addition to services, whatever that looks like in a culture, wanting human connection in addition to wanting the service.
So wanting human connection, and what I really appreciate about that is it loops back to what the first thing was that people brought up, which was losing human connection was the hardest part. And wanting to reestablish that, and not just have the facts, not just be told what the rules are, as important as that is, but having real human connection. Let's take two more, all right. Sorry, three more. Okay, and that's it.
It goes back to the visual that I think was up about a sense of not feeling patronized and feeling respected as a competent, capable adult in my own country with my own personhood. So when meeting with all of these professionals, to feel a sense of equality and respect for my own integrity as a competent, capable person.
I'm assuming everybody heard that, and I don't think that needs any statement by me. Thank you. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that it'd be important for the people that are trying to help me to know that I'm not going to be able to take anything in or learn anything if I'm scared. So finding a way to talk with me from a position that is from somebody that shares an identity with me or just helps me feel more comfortable.
So helping you feel more comfortable, recognizing that you're scared, and when you're scared, this is not a good way to take things in. Thank you. Last one, Cynthia.
I would just really appreciate it if people could be curious
about me, about my prior life, so that I exist over time.
So curiosity about your life, and that you're not just who you are in the moment, but that something existed beforehand. I just want to thank everybody for participating in this. And even though this took a chunk of the time that we have allocated for this section, I think it's really important. I actually think you will remember being in this exercise probably more than almost anything I'm going to talk about. And I think the more you can do what we just did and really try to imagine yourself in a situation like the one we've been in, this will help you to understand in a very tiny way, what it might feel like for some of the people you're trying to support and help. Okay, so can you see this in the back? No? Okay. And is there anything we could do that would make it better, or is it just make it bigger? Huh? The shades? Okay, we can put the shades down. I don't know if we can make it bigger. I'll just have to, while our technical expert, hey. Thank you, Alan. Okay, that's perfect. Excellent. I didn't think this was possible. Okay. So here's what I just want to quickly cover, and I'm really getting the sense that everybody knows this, but sometimes it's important to just state it. Saida mentioned this morning the notion of a social ecology, and it includes, and you've talked about this, social norms and practices. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. Language, cultural worldviews, values, that's part of our social ecology. Institutional supports or barriers, things that get in the way of our being able to achieve what we want to achieve. This came out a lot in your discussion: social networks, social capital. And you also brought up that part of the social ecology is climate, technology, geography, and the economic infrastructure and opportunity. And these are just part of what constitutes the social ecology for each of us. And again, if we were going to draw our own social ecology and then we shared it with one another, we'd see how some of it's similar, and we'd also see how some of it's very different. Okay? So the reason I'm bringing this up is that anytime we emigrate, anytime we are a refugee or we are seeking asylum, we are entering a new social ecology, and I think it brings up certain themes. And you've really hit all of them, so I'm going to cover them very quickly. That there's a lack of cultural and social familiarity, that there's less clarity, less certainty about the relationship between who I am and society. And that includes other people, institutions, organizations. And related to that, there's greater ambiguity about social roles. It's not clear not only who I am and how other people perceive me, but also who other people are and what they represent and what they do. And as we heard this morning, there's a lot of challenges to traditional family roles and processes. There's challenges to our social status. And I just want to quickly share this. I shared this with another group about a week ago. I go to Calgary for a project, and I always get picked up at the airport by a driver who takes me to the hotel I'm staying in. And every time I've been picked up, the person has come from South Asia, and they are working as an Uber driver or a taxi driver, and they have master's degrees or PhDs. And they can't use those degrees or skills in Calgary and to do what they were doing when they left Nepal, Pakistan, whatever country they had lived in. So they are, one of the reasons I think they're telling me about this is because it's a really hard thing to suddenly have your social status dramatically changed and to not be the person you were beforehand. There's issues of safety, security, and vulnerability, and you've talked about that, and I'm going to come back to that. There's that sense of having a sense of competence. There's feeling welcomed and unwelcomed, and I'm bringing that up because I know everybody in this room is here because you want this community to be a welcoming place for immigrants and refugees who are settling here. But having talked to many people in this community about what it feels like for them, who are refugees and immigrants, this country doesn't always feel welcoming, okay? And in fact, often people feel like they're not wanted, or that they're being mischaracterized as being criminals, or as being untrustworthy. And some of it's national, and some of it's local. Some of it comes from interactions with people, sometimes with well-meaning people, as well as people who actually don't have the best of intentions. And the last thing I want to stress, and I feel this came up over and over again this morning, and it's come up in my work all over the world, is that people are mourning when they leave their homes and they lose contact with their friends, their family, their social ecology, and they're mourning what they have left behind and what has been lost. And quite frankly, it's not one of those mourning phases and processes that just happens and then it's over. You know, it can go and it can change, it can shift, but I have found it's often always there. And it's really important to respect that and to allow space for that and to validate that for people. And I'd love to hear from other people when we have time for questions about your experience with that. So when we're trying to help people, and we're trying to help people certainly with the refugee project that's being offered by the current project that brought us all together, we're helping people who have experienced armed conflict. Okay, because I think I want to bring that in. It's not only being a refugee, but it's being a refugee from a part of the world where there was violence, where there was conflict, where there was a lack of safety, where people were trying to hurt you and kill you. And I think that there's two things that it raises. One is, what does it mean to be a person in a social and cultural context? And then, what is the relationship between self, family, community, and culture? And I want to just quote a fairly famous psychiatrist who's also an anthropologist, Arthur Kleinman. And he says the construction of self involves a dialectic between universal, biological, and social aspects of human nature. So, and by the way, I'm going to make this available so everybody can have a copy of it, okay? So if you can't write everything down, you'll have it. So I want to just stress that what he's saying there is we're all human beings. There are universal things where we are all the same. But then he goes on to say, that's on the one side, but then there's the process of creating meaning in particular social interactions based on shared cultural models and value orientations. And that's where we're not all the same. We don't carry the same models. We don't all have the same values. And the meaning of social interactions varies considerably. And I think when you are an immigrant, whatever your status is, that this is the part that is most jarring, that is most different, that is most challenging. So there's a guy named Derek Summerfield. He's an English psychiatrist, and he's come up with this notion of personhood. You know, when we talk about culture and cultural differences and cultural humility, we're talking about something outside of ourselves, and what Summerfield says is personhood is how it's inside of us. And that personhood affects, how do I make sense of my experience? Personhood, it influences, what do I share with other people, and how do I express it? And I've given this example a number of times about how when I was in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, that a man was explaining to me how he had lost members of his family and his village had been destroyed, and he was smiling, okay? So he didn't feel comfortable sharing what he was sharing with me, and he was also concerned that by sharing this with me, he might hurt me or create problems for me. So what we, and again, we're a pretty diverse group here and a diverse society, but the assumptions about what gets shared with people and how to express what we share can really vary. Who do I turn to for help? Do I go see a therapist? I know there are quite a few therapists in the room, okay? And who do I send my kids to for help if I think there's something wrong with them? Well, the majority of the world doesn't have a lot of therapists. And therapists aren't the people who people send people to or go to for help. Also, what's normal and what's abnormal? You know, if I started to cry while I was talking with you, and I really got upset, many people here might think, wow, that's kind of strange, that's kind of abnormal. But that's a cultural context, and that has to do with personhood. And I guess what I want to say is there's a considerable range of what's normal and what's abnormal and how we interpret it. After a plane crashed carrying many Dominicans in New York City right after 9/11, people were being, relatives and people who came to the site were being very expressive emotionally. And there were a lot of Western-trained psychiatrists who were freaked out by that and were medicating everybody to try and help them to calm down. So I use that as an example of a misunderstanding about what's normal and what's abnormal. What do I need to feel supported? What do I seek help for? These are just, you know, there's a lot more that goes into personhood, but I wanted to give you a few examples about how personhood can differ. So I want to do one last exercise with you. Do this one by yourself, and I'm going to just give you 3 minutes. I want you to think about your answers to the following questions. Who do you go to help when you are experiencing a crisis? If you have a crisis in your life, who are the first people you think of that you would go to for help? And the second one is, what lessons did you learn from your family about what helps you to survive a crisis or challenging times? Okay? So who do you go to help when you have a crisis? Who do you expect help from? And what lessons did you learn from your family? We'll take, like I said, 2 or 3 minutes. Just think about your answers to those questions. And then I'll ask you to shout them out. Who do you go to help when you have a crisis? Yes, Elizabeth.
Someone who I think really knows me.
So someone you think knows you, and someone who understands you. So I'm not hearing that it's like automatically family or friends or a professional, but it's more the important thing is that you feel understand. It's the quality of the relationship. What are some other things? A close friend. Husband. Mother. So I'm hearing sister. Self. You rely on yourself. Okay. And you talked about that when you were talking this morning and how important that is. Other people you go to. Okay, so that's not family. That's a group of people you find supportive, and it sounds like you have something in common with the people there.
It's a bit situational. It depends on the crisis.
Absolutely. So it depends on the type of crisis. So it's not like it's automatic that you always go to the same people. Right. So it's important to not generalize about that. Okay, so you kind of draw on your experience, and there's like trust, I'm hearing you say, because you've seen people exercise good judgment, which again is hard if you don't know a lot of new people who you've had that history with in a new situation. Ann. So to know that somebody's gone through something that you've gone through and they've successfully resolved it and dealt with it. Yeah. A spiritual mentor. Thank you for bringing that in, because very often that doesn't come up easily in a Western context. If I'd asked this question in Uganda, that would have been the first person people would have said. So for some people in this room, a spiritual person's really important. Okay, what lessons did you learn from your family about What helps you to survive a crisis or challenging times? Yeah.
Don't jump in and try to fix me or take care of me. Listen to me and just feel me.
Okay, listen to me, feel me, don't fix me. Yeah.
Dysfunctional, but learning like keep it very in the family, in the very immediate family, so not broadcasting
So
or reaching out beyond the immediate family.
keep it within the family, but I just want to challenge you on the word dysfunctional, because I feel like, if that works, I wouldn't call it dysfunctional. And I think that that's a fear that other people will think that what you do is dysfunctional because it doesn't fit with the culture that you understand. And I think that's really important when we're trying to support refugees and immigrants, that we don't consider their coping mechanisms dysfunctional or our own. Yeah. Nora.
Get on it. Get on it, act. Do it right, don't miss a beat. But I would also say that my grandparents were refugees, and I think that there is kind of a heightened, like, okay, crisis is coming, act now. Get everything in a row and get prepared. And I think that was given.
So get on it, fix it, and some of that you think comes from having been a refugee in your family.
So in my family, crisis never happens to me. Crimes happens to us. So in my family, I learned if you're in crisis, we're all in crisis, and we will all step up. And so you will never be alone in crisis.
I really appreciate that. And I think that is a really good example of, even in how I asked the question, I made a cultural assumption about that you are having a crisis and seeking help. And when I'm hearing you say it's never you, it's your family. So that's really important when we're thinking of trying to help someone, and that I might be thinking, I need to help this person, but they're not thinking that way at all, that they want help as a person. Yeah?
The opposite side of the spectrum, be self-sufficient.
Be self-sufficient. Right. So we're getting quite a range here. Yeah, take two more. Yes? So you have to believe in yourself. Yeah. Yes. Start drinking. I might have to take back what I said about everything being functional and not dysfunctional. I'm just teasing you. No, I'm teasing you.
It's just to believe is happening. You're in this situation, take it, accept it, and move on. You can't change anything, but it's not the end of the world.
So you can't change it, accept it, and move on. I know there's many more things for you to say, and I'm going to have to, unfortunately, move on. But I guess what I want to say is, I hope that you will ask this question when you're working with people. And as Saida said, we're always working cross-culturally. I never know the answer to that. In fact, I don't even know the answer for myself. And I think that's the other thing, to ask yourself that question and to think about who you go to, what your assumptions are, but then to be really open to hearing a very different worldview about somebody else's answer to that question. So here's some things that I thought about possible vulnerabilities for refugees. And I feel Saida covered this really in much greater detail this morning. But many of the people you're trying to support have witnessed or have been targeted by violence. We've talked about loss of income, occupation, but also social roles, loss of family and social supports, loss of a sense of place that's home, lack of a sense of safety and security, sense of rejection based on social group membership. I want to just flag that because I don't think that came up quite as strongly, which is that very often the people who have had to emigrate and against, was not necessarily a choice, very often it's based on social group membership, who you are, what your religion is, what your ethnicity is. And conflict often is based on that social group membership. Then you get to the United States, we have social group memberships and different statuses and different experiences that people have. So it's not like this only goes back to the country of origin, we also have to think about what does it mean once people get here? And how do we help people to understand what social group membership means here, and also challenge some of the barriers to full human personhood that comes with social group membership. And then again, the last thing I want to just mention are the possible psychological consequences. And Saida mentioned trauma, but also I've worked with people who have depression, anxiety, grief, guilt, etc. Yes? Right, so if you have one, it's hard enough and you need your full support system, but to have a lot of these and not have your support system.
And also not having the language in that new country.
And to not be able to express yourself as fully as you'd like to with the language. So I appreciate what you both added, but so one of the things I wanted to just quickly get up are what are some of the values that inform helping in the West? And I can already see that in this group, if I've left something out, you're going to let me know, and I want you to do that. There's a sensitivity here to psychological problems and vulnerabilities, particularly trauma, and that result from disasters and armed conflict and other overwhelming experiences. I say this because very often the focus is on the vulnerabilities and the trauma and the other things that I mentioned, like depression. There's a focus on the individual, and Saida called that out when she gave her answer to that question, which is the right to privacy. There's an assumption that if I'm a therapist and I see somebody, I see them alone, I see them in my office, it's confidential, I don't talk to their family about it, I don't talk to other people about it. There's an assumption that talking about problems helps. I think that's a deep-rooted one, and certainly in Western psychology. Come on, talk to me, ventilate. You know, you'll feel better after you talk to me. And one of the things I've learned the hard way is I've worked in cultures where people don't feel it helps. They actually feel it makes things worse. That trained professionals are needed, that we just can't have somebody who's a good friend who can really listen and help psychologically, but we need trained professionals when we have trauma and depression and things like that, and they provide counseling and psychological treatment. So the therapist is seen as expert. Now, believe me, I know many people here use those roles really effectively. I'm just trying to call out what I think some of the values are about when somebody needs help, particularly help for something that's considered, quote, severe, who do they go to? So now I want to shift a little bit, and then I want to get into resilience, which is these are what are the 8 processes that I think help people recover from disaster and armed conflict. And the first 5 in particular come from international empirical research. And again, even though how they manifest themselves looks different, I think the need is similar. So the first one is people need to feel safe. And we've already talked about how difficult it is to feel safe, how difficult it would be for you to feel safe if you had to move to Asia under the circumstances that we talked about earlier. The other thing is somebody talked about I'd be feeling scared, and it would be hard for me to take things in. It's hard to really take things in when you feel scared and anxious. So one of the things that's been found is to help people learn how to calm themselves is really helpful. What that means can vary considerably, but in general, people are able to think better, plan better when they are able to calm themselves. It doesn't mean they shouldn't express themselves emotionally or get upset, but the ability to calm yourself helps you to feel in charge. Competency. We all want to feel competent, and we want to feel competent about ourselves, but it also helps for us to feel as if our community is competent and our group is competent. You hit this one really hard, connections with other people and resources. Recovering a sense of hope. Hope is often a casualty of war, of conflict, of forced migration, and it's really hard, and especially somebody had said this earlier, you don't know what the future holds. It's sometimes hard to have a sense of hope. Now, here are 3 things that I've added to this. I mentioned grieving and mourning, including the experience of migration. I think that's a really important part of recovering from that process. A second one is reestablishing a sense of place. That's so obvious, and yet it's something that's so hard to achieve. What does a sense of place mean to you? To you, it might mean your house. It might mean your room. It might mean your street. It might mean your neighborhood. It might mean your workplace. It might mean where you walk your dog. Whatever it is, that's not something you would easily reestablish if it was taken away from you, completely taken away from you, and you were in a totally new place. And then the last one, and I'm going to go over that with a separate slide, is reestablishing connections with cultural practices and lessons learned from ancestors, what Judith Landau calls transitional pathways. Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
I think I would also add recognizing that the brain is affected by trauma, especially developing adolescence, and that it takes longer to learn things when you've experienced trauma.
So the brain is affected by trauma, and that trauma then makes it harder for you to learn things. And I think it's really important, and Saida talked about the assumption that people have experienced trauma, and you're talking about the impact trauma can have. And what I want to also throw out is that most people are resilient, and most people don't experience PTSD, and those who experience PTSD, if left alone without a psychologist or a social worker or a psychiatrist, will get better on their own. Okay? I'll come back to that. So this last point about transitional pathways. At any point in our life, we have a connection with our past and our future. Who we were, who our family was. When I asked you about lessons you learned from your family, cultural values, traditions, and a sense of there's a future. I'm moving towards something. I'm going forward towards something. I have goals I want to achieve. Those are both casualties very often during the transition of migration and immigration. So all these things in the past, all those things in the past get lost, and all those things in the future get lost. So our connections to our past and our future can be disrupted by this process, and when that happens, that destabilizes us in the present. So one of the goals, and I think challenges for all of us when we're working with people who've experienced this disruption in transitional pathways, is how can people reestablish them? For example, when Basilius showed you the slides that he showed this morning, which again, I recognize how much emotion and meaning probably went into every slide. To me, that was an example of a transitional pathway. It was saying, this is my past, and this is what happened to it, and I'm sharing this. This is part of who I am now in this moment, right? And that's an example of how a person can work to reestablish a transitional pathway. And as I mentioned earlier, hope involves looking forward to the future. So is that clear? Does people have any questions about that? All right, I have about 5 more minutes, so I need to quickly go through some things because I want to make sure we have a chance to let you ask questions. So this model, psychosocial capacity building, here's some of the assumptions. It's strength-based. It starts with the assumption, not the assumption that all people have experienced trauma, the assumption that all people carry sources of resilience. As Saida said this morning, what people have gone through to get here and survive, many people in this room might really struggle with. So that in itself is something that we can take as a starting point. The second one is that psychological well-being is not separate from social well-being. And again, in this culture, in this society, very often, like therapy almost tries to disaggregate that. I'm here to help you with your psychological well-being. Somebody else maybe will help you with your social well-being. But in my view, it's never really separate. The two go together. Cultural practices are centralized. They're never, and then we should think about culture as like the last thing. but really it's a starting point. It's how do we understand ourselves? How do we understand someone else? Respect for a range of healing processes. You know, I showed you on that slide what's kind of normative in the West about like going to a therapist. There's lots of ways to heal. There are traditional healers, there are spiritual healers, there are elders, there are family mechanisms for healing. We need to respect them, validate them, and encourage people to draw on them if they are helpful. And Saida talked about this morning, so I'm going to really not go into that because I think she covered that in great detail. Caution about unintended effects. I think it's really important to think about how, and again, I think Saida and a number of panelists talked about this, wanting to help somebody and doing something for somebody and continuing to do that can create a sense of dependency or reinforce a sense of dependency that a person acquired while they were in an internally displaced persons camp or a refugee camp. So always thinking about not only what are the good intentions and what can I do well, but what can go wrong. What can my good intentions lead to that I hope won't happen? So what does this look like in practice? And again, I'm not going to go over the first bullet because that was covered so thoroughly this morning. Partnerships with other people's groups, etc. And also being inquisitive. The third one I just want to go to, assuming competence. That's a starting point, as opposed to helplessness, as opposed to trauma and incompetence, competence. The fourth point, always including refugees and other key stakeholders when making plans and decisions. Transparency, when making suggestions about things. Somebody had brought this up, like, somebody had said, if I went to Asia and there were all those people there, why are they there? Well, transparency would involve, why are they there? What do they hope to help you with? In a greater way, perhaps, than you have to be transparent with somebody that maybe shares more cultural assumptions with you, because you can assume that maybe there's certain things that make sense to you both. But transparency is really called for the larger the cultural gap when working together. Attunement to sociocultural factors here in this country, like racism, like Islamophobia, like sexism, like homophobia, and challenges to values and traditions and the impact of all of this on the family. That when we're trying to help people, we have to try to recognize that some of these sociocultural factors may or may not affect me, but they well might affect the people I'm trying to help. Building on a foundation of natural and familiar activities and practices, and activities and opportunities that foster self-efficacy. Okay? People need to do things where they feel competent, where they feel good about themselves. And that could be formal, that could be informal, that could be fun, like a recreational group like playing soccer, that could be a task group like people making things together, talking together, but feeling a sense of self-efficacy. I'm going to have to bring this to a close, and there are some slides I didn't get through. I'm just going to show you what they are, so when you get this, you can go through them. I wanted to talk to you about resilience, and what does it mean, and basically my key takeaway here is it's not a trait. It's not like I'm a resilient person. It's a process. Resilience occurs with other people. So how can we foster and strengthen resilience? And what I go on to talk about are different kinds of resilience. Some of it's cognitive, like how you think. Some of it's emotional, not only how you feel and what you feel, but how do you manage and work with your feelings. Some of it's attachment, your relationship to other people, and how can we help people with that. And in each slide, I have implications for what you can do, okay? And feel free to email me if you have any questions about that. And resilience is not just within an individual, it's within a family context and a community context. And how can you feel resilient in that context and actually encourage and stoke that? And the last thing I wanted to cover is just working in groups is helpful. When we did that exercise, you talked a lot about people and how much it meant to be with people. When you're in groups, you're with other people. And in a lot of parts of the world, people do things in groups, sometimes family groups, clan groups, other kinds of groups. Here, sometimes there's a tendency to try and work on problems in a more individualistic way. And so I think whenever possible, to use groups. And just to conclude, as Arthur Kleinman said, we're all human beings. We have needs, we have vulnerabilities, we have strengths, we have assets, whatever our ethnicity and religion. And as a caring and compassionate, welcoming community, we need to recognize the full range of what does it mean to be a person if we really want to include a new person in this community. And I would venture to say that most of us, if not all of us in this conference, descended from immigrants and refugees, and all of our families, as well as us today, have contributed to our community. And the current group of immigrants and refugees who are arriving in this community bring rich sources of strength, assets, and they will make this community a better place. And they are already doing so. And so if we can appreciate the gifts that they offer, acknowledge the strength that it took for them to arrive here, respect their leadership in a genuine way, then we will be able to support them in their journey and to help them in this transition to this community. So I want to open this up for questions now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I'm sorry I took a little more time than I anticipated and I didn't finish anything. Comments, questions? We have 5 or 10 minutes that we could take for this. Nora.
I'm wondering if you have any ideas for people as we think about unintended consequences. That's always a hard thing because it's usually about what you don't know. And I'm thinking that the power of what we have here is a whole community to reflect with. And I know that we're taking emails, hoping that people will stay in connection. And maybe that's one source is, you know, sharing with each other. But do you have ideas about that? How do you anticipate negative consequences?
Okay, so the question was about how can we anticipate some of those unintended consequences. I actually, if it's okay with you, would like to throw that open to the group. I feel like I've talked a lot, and there's a lot of wisdom in this group. So, and you went through that exercise, and there are also people in this room who are immigrants and refugees. What are ways to get in touch with the possible unintended consequences? What would be helpful with that? Take risks. Transparency about motives, intentions, why you're doing something. Yeah. Don't make assumptions, ask questions, let that guide you. Say the same thing, okay. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. Owning it when you make mistakes. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about that because we're preparing for the summer at the Smith College School for Social Work, and a lot of faculty are going to make mistakes, using the wrong pronouns with people, committing microaggressions, and we're looking at what can be done when you make a mistake. And I think the first thing is to acknowledge it. The second thing I would add to that is to recognize you will make mistakes, and to be gentle with yourself in that sense, to not feel, oh my God, I can't do this kind of work. You know, I can't believe I just did this, and then want to crawl into a hole. So that's not helpful either. And then the third thing, though, is to acknowledge it, be gentle with yourself, and then try to do a better job. To learn from that, and to go over that, and to think to yourself, what can I do differently next time? You know, what life lesson did this teach me by making that mistake? What else?
This is related to what you just said, but it's not just about learning from it. It's also about acknowledging that you're open to learning from it. Because if you're working with someone who's feeling, you know, like they're not sure what to do, coming off as, you know, I always know what to do, or, oh, I made a mistake, is not the same as, I made a mistake, and I too need to learn and will. I think that really helps people feel open.
And that we're approaching this as equals, and that this is a partnership. This is not a hierarchical relationship. So that's really helpful. I know you have something back there. I'll be right back. Okay. Yes.
Feedback loop so people can give you the comment that you're off base and figure out a way to establish a feedback protocol so people can give the feedback that you are damaging them when you are not intending to.
That's such a great point. And if you do that and take that as an initiative and do it before something goes wrong, it's a lot easier then. You've invited the person to do that, as opposed to it just suddenly comes up. So thank you. Yeah, Saida, and then, okay, we've got two people here. I've seen you both. Okay.
Oh, I wanted to say that breaking down expectations can help if we want small steps can be more successful than bringing general ideas or just regular help and assume that we need to explain a little bit more. We need to go through a little bit more when the expectations is how can I say it? I want that to know that if you come to help me, don't expect much from me. Try to come back, or yes, try to come back, and on the same thing, you can come back 3-5 times, and don't judge me of not following you. So.
Wow, there was a lot in that. I mean, I just want to extract two things. You can come back again. Everything doesn't take place in one moment. And also that if I can't offer you something, then I can't necessarily expect something back from you. And I shouldn't take that personally, right? That doesn't mean that you've rejected me and I should never come back again. Okay, thank you. Yes.
I think it is important for us to establish our own sources of support and our own places where we can process the frustrations, the feelings of incompetency that we may have in our contact with people who come to us with different stories, strange stories, and I think it is important for us to have that.
Thank you for saying that. So we all need that. And this also loops back to, I think, something Saida said this morning. And I was trying to do that as well this afternoon. Everybody here is thinking about how can we help people feel welcome? How can we not make mistakes? How can we be effective in our work with immigrants and refugees? And so much of this is about exploring ourselves, right? I mean, the first place we tend to go is we have to understand the other people. And that's important, but we have to understand ourselves. Our privileges, our lack of privileges, our values, our assumptions, as we embark on this work. Should I end it here or take one more question? Okay, I always defer to Marcia, by the way.
Important point I think that was made was how self-disclosure can sometimes really be of help, and that we are not used to doing that. We're trained not to. In fact, it goes against our, ethics. But it's sometimes to how we can learn to use self-disclosure, because we are fellow human beings. We do come from refugee backgrounds too. How can we use that to effectively connect with people?
That's a nice note to end on, because again, if we're really working in a genuine partnership, then it's not a genuine partnership if I'm holding back a whole lot of myself. Again, like the panel this morning, shared so much of themselves. And if that's a one-way street, that the refugees and immigrants who are here are trying to teach us, and they're doing that by revealing who they are, and I never do the same, that's an unequal relationship. And so that's really a very important thing for us all to think about. How can we do the same thing that we are hoping people will do with us.